Obese bride arrived a week too late. Mountain man said, "You're right on time for me." The Wyoming wind cut through the station like a knife, carrying whispers of dust and disappointment. A crowd of men and wagons bustled around the small depot in the town of Elk Hollow, except for one man who stood apart, staring at the horizon. Luca Blackwood, 39, a former soldier turned recluse, waited with a battered hat in his hands and hope tucked somewhere behind his guarded eyes. He'd spent months exchanging letters with a woman he'd never met, a mail-order bride named Prudence Dalton, a widowed school teacher from Kansas City. The letter said she'd arrive on the 14th of May, but the 14th had come and gone. So had the 15th. By the 20th, the station master had already told him to stop coming. "She's not coming, Blackwood," he said gruffly. "Best forget it. Folks in her shape don't survive the trail." Luca just nodded, his jaw tightening. He'd lost faith before, in people, in God, in the war that had taken his brother, but this time felt heavier. He turned to leave, and that's when the train whistle blew. Steam hissed, brakes screeched, and a single passenger stepped off. A large woman in a worn gray dress, clutching a carpetbag and coughing into a handkerchief. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes fever bright. "Are you—" Luca began. She looked up, her voice trembling. "Prudence Dalton, 7 days late." He studied her in silence for a heartbeat, the exhaustion in her shoulders, the courage in her stance, the faint tremor in her hands. Then he smiled softly. "You're right on time for me." The onlookers chuckled behind them, some whispering cruelly about the fat old widow who'd come to marry a man she didn't deserve. But Luca didn't care. He offered his arm and said, "Let's get you home, Mrs. Dalton." And as the train hissed away, the mountain wind carried his quiet words, the first warmth Prudence had felt in years. The road from Elk Hollow to the Blackwood homestead wound like a scar through the foothills. Sharp turns, deep mud, and the echo of wolves in the distance. The wagon jolted over frozen ruts while Luca held the reins steady, stealing glances at the woman beside him. Prudence Dalton sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap, her face half hidden beneath a faded bonnet. She was not the woman from the photograph. That much was obvious. The picture she'd sent had been taken nearly 10 years ago, before the gray crept into her hair, before the years of loss, illness, and loneliness carved lines around her eyes. She was older, larger, and so very tired. "I suppose I owe you an apology," she said at last, her voice trembling with exhaustion and shame. "The woman you expected, she's long gone." Luca didn't look at her. "The woman I expected was someone brave enough to cross half the country for a new life. I'd say you fit that well enough." She blinked, startled. "You don't mind?" He shrugged. "You showed up. That's more than most do." As they climbed higher into the hills, Prudence told him about her journey, the train derailment near Cheyenne, the cholera outbreak at the way station, the days she spent tending to the sick while others fled. "I thought if I could help them," she said, eyes glistening, "maybe I could prove I still had worth. But it cost me my strength and almost my life." Luca's jaw tightened. "You stayed to help strangers?" "They were dying," she said simply. "I couldn't walk away." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not weakness, but the quiet courage of a woman who'd faced the worst and still chosen kindness. "You're a damn sight braver than most men I've known," he said softly. Prudence turned away, her throat tight. She'd been called many things in her life, stubborn, foolish, fat, inconvenient, but never brave. When the wagon reached the ridge, Luca pointed ahead. "There," he said. Below them stretched a wide valley of pine and snowmelt, a single cabin standing proud against the horizon. Smoke rose from its chimney, curling upward like a promise. "That's home." Prudence's breath caught. "It's beautiful. It's honest," he replied, "like the people I want in it." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll do my best to earn my place." He glanced at her again, pale, trembling, her hands raw from the cold, and said quietly, "You already have." That night, as the fire crackled inside the cabin, Prudence unpacked her few belongings: a small Bible, a photograph of her late husband, a folded letter she'd written, but never sent, to a man who would now never read it. Luca set a cup of tea beside her. "You'll sleep in the bed. I'll take the floor." She shook her head. "I couldn't." "You can, and you will." His tone was firm, but his eyes were kind. She hesitated. "You're too good to me." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I've just been waiting too long to have someone to be good to." And as the wind howled outside, Prudence Dalton, the bride who arrived a week too late, lay in a stranger's cabin, her heart steady for the first time in years, and wondered if she'd somehow arrived exactly where she was meant to be. Morning came slow and quiet on the mountain. Frost clung to the pines, and the first light crept across the valley like a promise. Prudence Dalton awoke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the sound of an axe splitting logs outside. She sat up, her body aching from the long ride and cold nights, but her heart strangely light. Through the window she could see Luca Blackwood, tall, broad-shouldered, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, steam rising from his breath as he worked. She'd written to him for months, but seeing him like this, flesh, warmth, and silence, felt different. He was not the desperate bachelor she had imagined. He was steady, watchful, and terribly alone. When he came back inside, snow clung to his beard. "You sleep well?" he asked simply. "I did," she said softly. "Better than I expected." He poured her coffee, black and strong. "You'll need it. The mountain's kind, but only to those who respect it." Over the next days, life on the ridge found a rhythm. Luca showed her how to build a fire in the wind, how to track rabbits by the thin trails they left in snow, how to chop wood without splitting her hand. Prudence listened, learned, stumbled, then laughed when she managed to light a fire without choking on smoke. "You learn fast," Luca said, nodding with approval. "I was a school teacher," she smiled, breathless, "though my students were easier to handle than these logs." He chuckled, a sound rare enough to feel like sunshine in winter. "Logs don't talk back, that's the difference." She laughed again, and for a fleeting second he forgot the years of silence that had defined his life. When they ventured into town 2 weeks later for supplies, the warmth between them met the cold of the outside world. At the general store, 2 women whispered loudly near the counter, "That's her, ain't it? The one from the train, the widow who came too late. Lord, look at the size of her. Poor man must have been desperate." Prudence's cheeks burned. She wanted to leave, to vanish. But before she could move, Luca stepped closer, placing a firm hand at her back. "Afternoon, ladies," he said evenly. "That woman you're talking about saved lives in a cholera camp while others ran. I'd think twice before using that tongue to shame courage." The women fell silent. Luca turned, met Prudence's eyes and said quietly, "You don't owe anyone an explanation." Her throat tightened. "You shouldn't have to defend me." He looked at her with that calm, steady gaze. "Then stop giving them reasons to think you need defending." It wasn't a rebuke. It was strength, the kind that steadied her spine instead of wounding it. That night, back in the cabin, she sat by the fire sewing a tear in her skirt. "No one's ever spoken for me before," she said softly. "You don't need someone to speak for you," Luca replied. "Just someone to stand beside you." She looked up. "And you would?" He met her gaze. "I already am." Something warm settled in her chest. The mountain outside was vast, cold, and merciless. But inside, she felt safer than she ever had in any city. Over the next few days, trust bloomed like spring beneath snow. She learned to shoot a rifle, her hands shaking the first time she pulled the trigger. He taught her to read the sky for storms, to use the rhythm of her own breath to find calm. At night, they shared quiet stories over stew, the fire crackling between them. Prudence spoke of her late husband, of loneliness, guilt, and the cruelty of people who saw her body before her soul. Luca listened without pity, only patience. When she finished, she said softly, "You must think me weak." He shook his head. "I think you've been carrying too much alone." She looked into the fire, voice barely a whisper. "And if I don't want to anymore?" He turned to her, his eyes gentle. "Then don't." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, soundless, endless. Inside, two strangers who had once written letters across states now shared a single silence, and somewhere within it, love began to breathe. By December, the valley had turned white again. Snow wrapped the mountain like a blanket, softening every sound. The days shortened into blue-gray light, and the nights belonged to the fire. Inside the small log cabin, the world felt suspended, two hearts learning how to live again. Prudence Dalton had grown stronger. Her hands, once unsteady, now chopped wood cleanly. Her cheeks glowed with color from the cold. She moved about the cabin with a quiet pride, sweeping the floor, stirring stew, mending shirts, all without the self-consciousness that once shadowed her every gesture. Luca noticed. "You work too hard," he said one evening, watching her knead bread dough at the table. "I like the feeling of earning my supper," she replied. He smiled. "You've earned more than supper. You've earned this mountain." She looked up at him, surprised. "You mean that?" "Every word," he said simply, his deep voice steady as the wind outside. Life in the cabin followed its own gentle rhythm. At dawn, Luca would leave to check his traps or cut timber. By mid-morning, Prudence would be waiting with a pot of coffee and a story to tell. Sometimes she read aloud from her old books, poetry, bits of scripture, or letters from students who still remembered their Miss Dalton. Luca would sit by the window, carving small figures from wood, pretending not to listen, though every word seemed to carve something soft inside him. One afternoon, she found a carving on her pillow, a small bird, wings spread. On its base, Luca had etched 3 words, "Still flying, Prudence." She traced the letters with trembling fingers, smiling through tears she didn't try to hide. When storms came, they weathered them together. Once, the chimney clogged and smoke filled the room. Prudence, coughing, tried to lift the heavy iron grate. Luca grabbed it from her his hands black with soot. "You'll burn yourself," he scolded. "I'm not made of glass," she shot back, coughing but laughing. He looked at her, astonished, at the spark in her eyes, the strength in her shoulders. "No," he said finally, "you're made of steel." At night, the mountain wind howled, and the two of them would sit close by the fire. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't need to. He told her about the war, the noise, the smoke, the silence afterward that never left him. She told him about her late husband, the kindness that had faded into cruelty, the night she'd finally fought back, the guilt that followed her across every mile. Luca listened without judgment. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said quietly. "There's no sin in wanting to live." For the first time, she believed it. As winter deepened, the bond between them became something unspoken but undeniable. When she caught her sleeve on a nail, he knelt and mended it himself. When he fell ill for 2 days, she sat by his bedside, spooning broth into his mouth and humming hymns until he slept. One evening, as the snow piled high against the window, Luca looked at her across the firelight. "You know," he said, "I used to think this cabin was the end of my life. Turns out it was just waiting for you to walk in." Prudence's breath caught. She didn't answer, not in words. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His rough fingers turned, closing gently around hers. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, a miracle unfolded. Quiet, simple, sure. But peace on the mountain rarely lasted long, because spring would bring more than melting snow. It would bring men who wanted to take everything they had built. Spring broke over Wyoming like a slow confession. The snow shrinking into rivulets that ran down the mountain, the air filled with pine and thawing earth. Life began to stir again, but with it came the echoes of trouble. It started with hoofbeats. Luca Blackwood heard them first. 3 riders cutting through the valley, their silhouettes sharp against the morning mist. He stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his instincts stirring like an old wound reopening. The man in front wore a tailored coat and a silver badge on his lapel. "Theodore Wells," he introduced himself, "Railway Commissioner." Luca said nothing. Wells dismounted, brushing dust from his gloves. "I'm here on behalf of the Great Western Rail Company. We've purchased this stretch of land, everything from the ridge to the river, including this cabin." Luca's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "I have documents," Wells replied, smiling thinly. "Filed in Cheyenne last month. I suggest you pack your things before construction begins." Prudence appeared at the door, her apron still in her hands. "You can't take this land," she said firmly. "He's lived here for years." Wells looked her over, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "And who might you be?" "His wife," Luca said before she could answer. "And she's right. You've got no claim here." Wells smirked. "We'll see about that." As the men rode off, Luca's shoulders stiffened. "The railroad's been circling these mountains for years," he said grimly, "but they've never come this far north." Prudence touched his arm. "What will we do?" He looked at her, his gaze steady. "What we always do. We fight." That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, another letter arrived, this one addressed to Prudence, carried by a mail rider from town. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was familiar, her sister's. "Dearest Prue, News has reached Kansas City. A deputy is looking into Henry's death. He says it wasn't an accident, that you fled before answering questions. Be careful. Lydia. The paper slipped from her fingers. Her late husband's name, Henry Dalton, seemed to echo off the cabin walls. Luca caught the change in her face immediately. What is it? She swallowed. Before I came here, there was an accident. Accident? My husband, she whispered. He was drunk, angry. He raised his hand to me again. I pushed him just once, and he fell down the stairs. He died instantly. Luca said nothing for a long moment. The only sound was the wind at the window. I told the sheriff the truth, she continued, but they wouldn't believe me. They said a woman my size couldn't have been frightened, only violent. So I ran. I changed my name. I thought I could start over. When she looked up, tears blurred her vision. If they find me, they'll hang me, Luca. He reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. No, they won't. Not while I'm still breathing. Days later, the mountain brought both threats together. Wells returned, this time with 2 hired guns and the deputy from Kansas City, Garrett Lowe, riding beside them. Mr. Blackwood, Wells called from the yard, I told you we'd be back, and it seems your wife has unfinished business with the law. Luca stepped forward, rifle in hand. You'll get neither the land nor the woman. Turn around. Garrett dismounted, holding up his hand. I came to hear her side, that's all. I read the coroner's report. It didn't add up, not for or against her. I just want the truth. Prudence stood tall in the doorway, her heart pounding. Then you'll have it, she said, stepping outside. Her voice wavered but did not break. I killed him, but I did it because I wanted to live. The deputy studied her for a long moment, then turned to Wells. You didn't tell me she saved cholera victims on her way here. Wells scowled. That's irrelevant. Maybe not, Garrett said, because I've seen murderers, and I've seen survivors. She's the second kind. Before Wells could protest, thunder cracked overhead. A storm was rolling down the valley, fast and fierce, and in the chaos, one of Wells's men slipped on the ridge, tumbling into an icy ravine. Without hesitation, Luca dropped his rifle and dove after him. Minutes later, he reappeared, dragging the half-frozen man to safety. Even Wells couldn't find words. Garrett turned to Prudence. Seems this mountain breeds better men than most towns. He tipped his hat. As far as I'm concerned, Mrs. Dalton died in Kansas City 3 years ago. Then he mounted his horse and rode into the storm, leaving Wells staring after him, beaten by more than weather. That night, as the thunder faded and the fire crackled again, Prudence sat beside Luca, her hand resting over his. You could have been killed, she whispered. He smiled faintly. Worth it. For saving a stranger? He looked at her, his eyes warm in the firelight. For saving what's mine. The storm howled for 3 straight days, hammering the mountains with snow and thunder like the wrath of heaven itself. Inside the cabin, Luca Blackwood and Prudence Dalton waited, hearts steady but wary. The fire crackled low, shadows trembling across the log walls. I don't think he's finished, Luca said quietly, watching the window. Men like Wells don't walk away when they lose. Prudence nodded, her voice calm, but her eyes alert. Then we won't run either. I've done enough running for one lifetime. Luca gave her a small, proud smile. Good, because I'd rather die fighting beside you than live alone again. She reached across the table, taking his calloused hand. "Then we'll fight together." When the storm cleared, the valley gleamed white under a pale sun. Smoke rose from the trees below. 3 riders again. Wells had returned, this time desperate, furious, and armed with a warrant forged in Cheyenne. He dismounted, face red with rage. "You think a single act of mercy makes you untouchable, Blackwood? This land is ours, and that woman is wanted in Kansas City." Luca stepped out onto the porch, rifle steady in his hands. "You'll leave now, Wells." Wells sneered. "Or what? You'll shoot me?" Prudence opened the door behind Luca, her voice strong. "If he doesn't, I will." The men laughed until they saw she wasn't bluffing. Her hands were firm, her eyes unflinching. The woman who had once cowered before cruelty now stood with the weight of every scar behind her. "You killed your husband," Wells spat. "What's one more body to you?" Her jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "I didn't kill him out of hate. I did it to stay alive. The difference is what you'll never understand." The man beside Wells raised his gun. "We're done talking." But before he could fire, Luca's shot split the air, a clean, deafening crack. The bullet hit the snow by the man's boots, a warning clear as thunder. "Next one won't miss," Luca said coldly. Wells froze, fury boiling in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, Blackwood." Luca stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "The only mistake would be letting you walk back down this mountain thinking you could take what's ours." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Wells lowered his gun. "You think you've won, but the railroad doesn't forget." "Neither does the land," Luca said. "It remembers who bleeds on it and who defends it." Wells mounted his horse, his men following. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Maybe not," Luca replied, "but it is for today." When the riders vanished into the trees, Prudence finally exhaled. Her knees trembled, but Luca caught her before she could fall. "You did it," he whispered. "You stood your ground." Tears filled her eyes, not of fear, but relief. "You gave me something worth standing for." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You gave me something worth living for." That night, the mountain was still. The storm had passed, and the stars burned bright over the valley. Prudence stood at the window, her reflection mingling with the firelight. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked softly. Luca came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Maybe, but they'll find us ready." She leaned into him, her voice steady. "I used to think love was something gentle, quiet, but it's not, is it?" He smiled against her hair. "No, real love's a fight worth bleeding for." And in that moment, surrounded by silence and snow, they both knew, whatever came next, they would face it as one. Weeks passed. Spring crept gently down the mountain, melting the snow and washing the valley in green. The birds returned first, tiny bursts of color and song that made even Luca pause in the middle of chopping wood just to listen. Inside the cabin, Prudence Dalton tended to a patch of wildflowers she had planted near the porch. Her hands were still rough from winter work, but now they trembled not from fear, only from the quiet wonder of having survived. Luca watched her from the doorway, leaning on his axe handle. He still marveled at her, the way she hummed when she worked, the way she refused to see herself as anything but useful, even when the world had once called her too much. "Those flowers will never grow in mountain soil," he said teasingly. "Then they'll learn to be stubborn, like me." she replied, smiling without looking up. He laughed, the sound echoing across the quiet ridge. "You're not stubborn. You're steady." "Same thing," she said. That night they sat by the fire, as they had through storms and silence and everything between. The air outside was cool, but the cabin glowed with a golden warmth, the smell of stew, pine wood, and peace. Luca reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet pouch, weathered from years of keeping. "There's something I've been meaning to give you," he said. Prudence looked up, curious. He opened it and drew out a simple gold ring, its surface worn, its beauty quiet but enduring. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She told me once that I'd know who it was meant for when I met a woman strong enough to carry both her own pain and someone else's." Her breath caught. "Luca?" He knelt, right there on the cabin floor. "You came a week late, Prue, but I think maybe you were right on time for me. Will you marry me, not because we need each other to survive, but because I don't want to face another sunrise without you in it?" Tears glimmered in her eyes, but her smile was steady. "I thought I'd missed every chance life had to offer me," she whispered, "but you've shown me that love doesn't come when it's convenient. It comes when we're finally ready to hold it." She extended her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, like it had waited decades for that very moment. Later, they stepped out onto the porch together. The moonlight spilled over the pines, the mountain stretching out before them in quiet majesty. Luca wrapped an arm around her. "You ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming here?" Prudence leaned into him, her eyes on the stars. "Not for a second. The world told me I was late, Luca. But maybe I just arrived at the part of my story that was finally worth living." He kissed her forehead, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're never too late for anything again." She smiled, resting her head against his chest as the night wind danced through the pines. And somewhere between the past she'd fled and the future they'd begun, the mountain exhaled, content, eternal, bearing witness to a love that had found its way home. When I think of Prudence Dalton, I don't see a woman who came too late. I see a woman who carried her grief across miles of dust and snow, who faced the world's cruelty and still chose kindness over bitterness. And when I think of Luca Blackwood, I see a man who once believed his life had ended, until love knocked on his cabin door a week behind schedule. You see, timing is a strange thing. The world will tell you you've missed your chance, that you're too old, too broken, too late. But love, real love, it doesn't live by timetables or photographs. It arrives when your soul is finally quiet enough to hear it, when you've lost enough to understand what's worth keeping. Prudence didn't come late. She came exactly when the mountain and the man were ready for her. And maybe that's how it is for all of us. Maybe what's meant for you isn't gone. It's just walking toward you through the storm, a little slower than you hoped, but still coming. So wherever you're listening from, whether it's a city apartment, a lonely farmhouse, or your own quiet mountain, remember this: you are not too late. You are right on time for the love, the healing, the peace that was always meant for you. Now tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Because every time you share your stories, your cities, your hearts, you remind me that no matter the miles between us, we're all just people waiting for love to find us. And sometimes Love only needs to whisper, "You're right on time for me."